Hi everybody, welcome to another 10 minutes to video. This is our video series where we're trying to help explain concepts for our faculty in 10 minutes or less or 10 slides or less. These are introductory, so we hope that they'll be used by you to help then have a conversation with us about how we can help you more. So today's topic is cost sharing. I'll share my screen here with you and go to the first slide. All of our 10 minutes to videos can be found on the ASU New College YouTube channel. So as I said, today is cost sharing, and I want to make sure that I give credit where credit is due here. There's a site at the Research Administration site for ASU that talks about cost sharing, and some of the information I'm sharing today comes directly from that site. You can just go to that link in case you want to learn more as a first place for learning about cost sharing. All right, so the first question we're commonly asked is, what is cost sharing? And cost sharing is that part of the project that isn't going to be paid for by the sponsor. So you're responding to a call by a sponsor, a federal agency, for example, and there's some portion of the research you're going to do that is going to be covered by you or somebody else, but not the grant itself. And you're expected to demonstrate that cost as part of your grant budget. Typically, when a sponsor requires cost sharing, it's one-to-one. So that means if you're going to ask the agency for $5,000, you need to come up with another $5,000, either from funds at ASU or other sources that are allowable for cost share. That is variable from sponsor to sponsor, though, so you do want to look that up closely in terms of the sponsor requirements. ASU's policy regarding cost share is that sponsored projects should be funded to the maximum extent possible by those external resources. Okay, so by the sponsor, that is the point of a sponsored project. That's really important because this then frees up other monies at the university for covering other important costs that the university bears, including supporting you as a faculty member in other ways. So only mandatory, and that means that when the sponsor requires a cost-sharing contribution, only that mandatory cost sharing should be considered by a PI and be part of their grant proposal budget. People often think that, oh, well, if I cost share, wouldn't that improve my chances of getting the grant? And actually, that's typically not the case. For example, National Science Foundation has actually prohibited cost sharing in most cases because they understand that this can lead to some uncertainty in terms of how the work will actually get done. So typically this is discouraged unless the sponsor requires it. So let's say the sponsor does require cost sharing. What kinds of costs can you share? So one of the main ways to contribute to cost share is your contributed effort, which would come out then in terms of your salary, including the fringe benefits that would go into the budget of your grant as your cost share contribution. Another area that can be cost shared is what's called unrecovered Fna. So ASU has a particular Fna rate or overhead rate that we can charge to recoup the cost of doing our research business. That rate is set by the federal government through a process, and some grantors, some agencies, will set a ceiling that is below the normal rate that ASU could typically charge. So the difference between the maximum that granting agency will allow and the rate that ASU is allowed to charge is said to be unrecovered, and you can use that difference as a cost share. Another thing that can be used as cost share are other direct project costs that are going to be covered by other university funds. And I'll go over a list of those possible sources of university funds in just a minute. But the last area, which is common for cost sharing, would be donations, so third-party cash or donated goods and services even. So these would be things that would typically be routed through ASU Foundation. And you then can use that foundation account as a source of cost share. You do need to track that very, very closely. So the donations are one of the hardest ones to track. I want to note that your laboratory space or existing equipment, which is said to be infrastructure, cannot be cost shared. And there's a couple of reasons for that. This graph is from that ASU site I mentioned at the beginning, this table rather, and explains the difference between infrastructure as a resource and cost sharing as a resource. So infrastructure refers to resources that are available to conduct your research more generally, even in the absence of grant funding, for example. And because it can cover many projects and many uses, it's difficult to represent to sponsors in terms that are other than very general. So it's hard to say how much of your space is dedicated specifically to a project. In cost sharing, we're talking about resources dedicated specifically to the project you're proposing to that funding agency. The spaces available to you are you're not legally bound to using those spaces. There's no documentation typically for your use of those spaces. Therefore, we don't tend to report them to the sponsor. And if you, didn't present the use of those spaces, it may not result in a loss of funding, and we don't tend to audit how those spaces are used. On the flip side, cost sharing represents a legally binding agreement because you're proposing it to a sponsor. There is extensive documentation for that agreement. If you fail to meet that cost sharing agreement, you will probably lose the funding associated with that cost share. And it is therefore a key component in all of our audits, external audits, meaning somebody else who comes in to audit ASU's accounts. So if you have decided to use funds for cost share, other than your salary or making up that difference in direct or overhead costs, what can you use? So you can use funding from your startup package if you have startup funds. You can use professional development funds that have been allocated for research to you by your department or your division. You can use indirect cost returns. So for example, the indirect costs are going to be returned to you by the grant or even by previous grants if they're sitting in an IIA account or RIT account. You can discuss with your director using those funds as cost share in this grant. Or you can use other campus funds that are accessible to you. Whenever you're using funds like this for cost share, you need to work with your school director or his or her designee about using these funds. There needs to be an understanding and agreement between the two of you that these funds are going to be used in this way so that we can then set up the documentation procedure that needs to occur. Typically, it is the case that funds from other grants or other contracts cannot be used as cost share. So typically you wrote a grant to do a certain project that would be separate and isolated from this new project they're proposing, and therefore that other grant cannot be used as cost share. And that's actually typically, that's a federal guideline that applies in most of these cases. If your project is funded, do you need to track the cost sharing? Yes, absolutely. The cost share is a pledge to the sponsor. It's going to be in your award notice, and so, like I said, it is auditable. So you need to keep detailed records on the amount of cost sharing and how that cost sharing is coming in and being used. Now, if it's your salary that's cost sharing, that's a little bit simpler. We will work with you, your team will work with you to track that salary amount that's moving back and forth, but the cost share account needs to be set up, and you need to make sure that that has happened. If you're talking about donations or some of these other things that are harder to track, the burden is really on you to make sure that this is tracked very, very closely and can stand up to an external audit. Again, we always encourage you to be working very, very closely with your director when it comes to cost share and making sure that he or she has an understanding of what you're doing in this space, and then that is being fulfilled throughout the life of the grant. So that's cost share in a nutshell, 10 minutes or less and 10 slides or less. Thanks for joining us.